Hello, I'm Deb Dubovich, and I'm a board member of the Kankakee Valley Historical Society. And I'm standing here in front of the historic Collier Lodge. This sad, dilapidated building may not look like much now, but if its walls could talk, it would tell wondrous tales of its rich history. This is the last of the historic hunting lodges that once were up and down the Kankakee River. This structure also served as a hotel, a general store, a single-family residence, and even as a brothel. Indeed, this entire area is steeped in history. Before the river was straightened and the wetlands drained for farmland, this was the narrowest part of the river, and a ferry shuttled people back and forth. Because this was also one of the highest points on the river, ancient people like the Paleo, Archaic, and Woodland people camped here. French voyagers stayed here. Under this ground lies a wealth of archaeological treasures, all telling of different times and different peoples. Professor Mark Schurr of Notre Dame University has conducted numerous archaeological digs right here on the Collier Lodge property.
Just a few of the many, many thousands of artifacts that were collected from the Collier Lodge site during the Kankakee Valley Historical Society Notre Dame excavations. But even this small sample can tell us a lot about life at Collier Lodge and who lived there in the past. The earliest Native American occupations of northwestern Indiana are known as the Paleo-Indian. That was a time period when the climate was much more like the Arctic is today, and there were large animals like the mammoth and mastodon that are extinct. We have not found any evidence of occupations from that period at Collier Lodge. The next period is called the early archaic, and that's the period when forests start to appear in our region, and we start to see plants that we would be familiar with. And this is our oldest artifact from the Collier Lodge site. It's a knife or a spear point that dates to the early archaic. It's about 11,000 years old. It's the earliest evidence we have of people living at Collier Lodge and probably using this site to get resources from the marsh and across the Kankakee Marsh. Over time, early archaic points change. These changes in styles over time are just like our changes in style, because the cultures continue to evolve as they develop new ways to live in the forest. During the middle archaic, people learn how to make groundstone tools, axes and things like that, and begin to exploit the forest even more. And these kind of tools here show that people were living at Collier Lodge during the Middle Archaic. That's 6,000 to 4,000 BC. That's 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, an incredibly long time. Eventually, at the end of the Archaic, during the late Archaic, people are fully adapted to using the wild resources of the forest. They have an annual round that takes them throughout the landscape using whatever's available at any time. And Collier Lodge was one of the places they stopped at in that annual round. And they might have visited there several times of the year. During the spring and the waterfowl migration, in the summer when there was fish and turtles and things to collect, and perhaps camping in the winter briefly to cross the marsh. Eventually, though, we get into what we call the Woodland period, identified by the first appearance of pottery. And the early Woodland period is the first Woodland period. This looks like a piece of dried mud, pretty much, but it's actually a piece of pottery. It's a piece of early woodland pottery, the first pottery that was made in the region in northern Indiana. This dates to around 1000 BC, about 3,000 years old. This type of point here is characteristic of the early woodland period, the Adena point. At this time period, people in southern Ohio were developing complex mound burial and other kinds of symbolic structures that would later lead to what we call the mound builders in northern Indiana. Over time, their pottery evolved just like their stone tools, becoming a little thinner, little better made, various kinds of decorations that can be used to date it. This would date to the late early woodland, or what we call early middle woodland. The middle woodland period is an important period in North American archaeology. That's the period when the mounds by Boone Grove or Up Wark were constructed. There's a great boost of ceremonialism and trade. Strangely, we find no artifacts from the middle woodland period at the Collier Lodge site. Whatever they were doing during that period, they were not living at Collier Lodge. We don't know whether they were, whether the climate conditions made it so that it was not a good time to cross the marsh, or maybe there were other times to cross the marsh because it was a very warm period. Or it could be that in their seasonal round, they did something else, perhaps went and built mounds, when in the past their ancestors would have camped at the lodge. We just don't know. However, over time, people come back to the Collier Lodge site. By the late woodland period, we see two important introductions. We do see a new kind of pottery, but that's not the most important thing. The first thing we see that's important is the appearance of the bow and arrow. This is the first time this bow and arrow was used, and that's a tool that's ideally suited for hunting in a forested environment. It allows you to very silently ambush prey and with great accuracy. And we see many of these triangular points from the site. And once the bow and arrow is developed, that's the main type of stone tool that you see from the point period and the main type of weapon that was used. The late woodland people were the first Native Americans to grow corn in the region. We have found some plant remains from the site, and we found exactly one corn kernel from the site. So they were living at the site, but their main focus was not on growing corn. It was probably on using the resources from the marsh during the warm months. Eventually, a new kind of pottery, the final kind of prehistoric pottery, comes into the region. Around AD 1200 or 1300, we get pottery that contains crushed clam shells, mussel shells. They would collect clam shells from the marsh, burn them, and put them in the pottery to make a really superior, high-quality pottery. This is from the Upper Mississippian period, the last prehistoric period. This is one of the most prominent prehistoric occupations at the marsh. It's a period that people were living, they're connected with the plains. They made pottery, large pots with a rim that stuck out and a large globular pot, very well made, decorated with some vertical lines. Here's another example of that characteristic rim, very easy to identify. Prehistoric period ends in 1679, when the French explorer La Salle made a journey down the Kankakee River from the South Bend, Portage, down to the Illinois. We don't have any evidence that La Salle stopped at the site, but he must have gone by it. It would have been great if he'd camped there. After he comes through the area, the history of the area is very poorly known. There are very few written records about the Kankakee until the late 1700s and beyond. However, we do find a few rare artifacts in our excavations that show people were stopping at the site in the early 1600s. This is a piece of brass that was made into a small cone. People call these tinkling cones. You could sew them on your clothes and they would tinkle and be a nice decoration. Similar type of artifact, a rolled copper tube or brass tube that would make a bracelet. And these were things that Native Americans made. They would obtain metal, brass kettles from the French and rework them into artifacts that they wanted during this period. So this indicates that Native Americans that were in contact with the French were living at the site during the early 1600s. Over time, the first real name for Collier Lodge was Baum's Bridge, but before that it was called Potawatomi Ford, because the Potawatomi camped there and forded the marsh. We have very few artifacts we can identify from that period, but here's one small piece, a little triangle of cut silver that was in use during that early 1800s that may have been dropped and lost by a Potawatomi who crossed the marsh at that site, or perhaps an earlier Native American, such as Miami, who also lived in the area. In the 1820s, American pioneers were coming into the region of the Kankakee. And we see the Schurr established a ferry there in the 1820s. And over time, there became a permanent settlement by the Eatons at the site. And they built a cabin, and they obtained pottery from traders. This pottery was made in England, but was widely used in northern Indiana in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. This is an example of a plate that came out of a trash pit at the Collier Lodge that would have dated to that time period. We also see other styles, like this hand-painted pottery from the 1840s, that show us that there was good domestic activities there, and people were living at the site and throwing out artifacts. Other common artifacts are things like clay pipes, very common in that time period, kind of a disposable pipe that you would smoke and then throw away. Very, very common at the site. So with all this information, we get a lot of data about how people lived at the site, and we're still working to study it off and on.
The information and data acquired by Professor Mark Schurr during the archaeological digs here at the Collier Lodge site show its rich history. One truly remarkable fact is that people have lived and hunted on the small 1-acre parcel of land for over a millennia, on and off for 11,000 years. The Kankakee Valley Historical Society is working hard to restore the old Collier Lodge and to preserve and promote the history, culture, and ecology of the Kankakee River area, preserving it for ourselves and generations to come. So on behalf of the Kankakee Valley Historical Society, I want to thank you for your support and interest.